Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Fuse Games Conference, a completely online and free conference from Staffordshire University's Games Department. Our next guest is a lighting artist at Ubisoft Massive and an authorised Unreal instructor who is eager to share their passion for lighting and storytelling with you. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Filippo Romani. Welcome, Filippo.
Hello, thank you.
Additionally, I'd like to introduce everybody to my colleague, Chris Pyle, who is also going to be helping out within this show. So welcome to the both of you. I'm really looking forward to this one. It's a topic of very close to the work I'm going to be doing soon myself, very much so. So really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, Filippo.
Okay, I have quite a lot to say, to be honest. So should we start right away, or is there anything else?
Yeah, let's get into it. The juicy
Okay.
stuff.
So let me share my screen. And let me know if you are seeing this.
All good.
Okay. So what we are talking today is going to be about PBL, or physically based rendering, and we'll get to that in a moment. But first, I would like to start talking more generally about lighting, and I would like to start by introducing myself. Of course, as you just said, I'm currently a lighting artist at Massive Entertainment. I'm also an Unreal Engine authorized instructor, and before that, I was a freelancer. I worked with the various big and small brands. And also I was a lighting and technical artist at Leo, which is a small AA studio in Italy. And I've been doing lighting for a few years now, and I've been steadily going towards a workflow based around PBL. And again, we'll get there in a moment. But I would like to start from this first and foremost. A very simple question that I feel like might be sometimes kind of be a given when you don't think about it. But if we really ask ourselves what is lighting, it's not always such a simple question to answer, because different studios require different things from the lighting artists. Some people approach it in a way, some other people approach it in another way. Some people also want to look at look dev. I mean, there are a lot of things. Some are more technical, some are more artistic. But fundamentally, lighting is a very simple difference between something like this and something like this, which might sound very stupid for some for in a way, but honestly, lighting is basically just how we make the world around us, or the world that we are presenting in a video game or in a movie, perceivable through sight, which is one of our main senses. So that is the tool of the lighting artist. But once we have defined that, what is that the lighting artist actually do? And it's also something that is kind of course, different for different studios. It's not always so straightforward. But put simply, again, it's taking something like this and turning it into something like this. So that if we want to put in a more understandable words, is someone that takes a space or a subject based on, of course, the media we are working in, and not only makes it perceivable through sight, but it also makes it understandable in a mental way and also emotionally. So we are not just putting lights to make things simpler to see, but we're also putting lights to evoke something, to tell a story. That is the basics, of course, of what a lighting artist do, the basic requirements. Then there are other things that are more technical, but these are the very fundamental things that we strive for. And when we say lighting artist, we got this very small but important, heavy word, which is artist. And I would like to speak a little bit about this because you will see that it will come back on what we are talking about today. And the artist is, you know, in the in the common conception of the word, someone that express something, mostly himself or themselves, through an art form, which could be any kind of art form, right? But what we do as lighting artists in the industry, be it the movie industry, the industry, or the gaming industry, is not properly art, if that's the definition we are taking. Because what we are doing, what our goal is not to express ourselves. In some part it is, but it's not our ultimate goal. Our ultimate goal is to create something that is not only beautiful for everyone, for most of the people that will see it, but it's also functional to the human experience. And that is a definition that is much, much closer to the one of a designer than an artist. So informally, I prefer, when I'm speaking about my role, to be called a lighting designer. Because when I'm thinking about lighting in a video game, I'm not thinking about how, you know, to express something I'm feeling. I'm thinking about how to create that an emotion in someone else. And that is different than what an artist, I feel, does. So this is a very important point, and we'll see why in a minute. And one beautiful quote that relates to this is from Ezra Pound, which says, "One definition of beauty is aptness to purpose." So, for example, this lamp, the I think it's called the storm lamp. It's a very iconic design, but it's not designed like that just out of the creativity of who made it. It's a design like that because it has a role, which is to withstand a storm and keep the flame alive, even with strong wind and rain and water. And that drives the design. And it's still iconic, like many things that we find everywhere around us. Just think about architecture, which is, I feel like, one of the most important fields when talking about lighting in video games, because we are much closer to work like an architect, like a lighting designer, than for example, director of photography for a film or a painter. And that is something else that I would like to talk about to get to where we are going today, which is the fundamental problem of digital light. So let's go back a little bit on this and think about something very simple. Let's take other disciplines like modeling, like texturing, like animation, and think about where they draw their references from. And if we think about it, their references are always photographs, are always even tangible. So they might have the object that they need to model in front of them. They might have the texture they need to reproduce. If they are animators, they are going to maybe take a video of themselves doing that action to then reproduce it on the character. So anytime other disciplines take a reference, is a very concrete reference, and then maybe they mix it up and make something cool, but it's still very based on reality. But what I see usually, I taught a lot of classes on lighting and on Unreal Engine, and I always saw that lighting was this kind of mystical discipline where you don't exactly feel like you have always a workflow, or you don't know exactly what you are doing. You are kind of eyeballing it. And I feel like the references that most people take for lighting are shots from movies, are photographs taken by some subject by some great photographer. They are drawings, they are concepts, they are any kind of form of art, really. But that creates kind of an issue because we are deriving our work from something that is already mixed up and made up by someone else. And if we go a little back from our references and see where photographers and director of photography and concept artists, where they take their references from, it usually goes back to one single point of reference, which is painters, like the old masters, which kind of discovered a lot of things about human perceptions that allows us to make an image look simply beautiful, right? But there's a very big issue with that, and that is that painters treat light as a simple brushstroke. So they of course understand light very well. This is a very famous paint from Rembrandt, which is called the Night Watch, and they understand. The great painters understood light very well, how it shapes forms, how it falls on the shapes, how it models, and the chiaroscuro. But even though they understood it, they took very big liberties when applying it on their works. Just let's take this hugely famous example. We have like this this woman on the back, which is standing out from everything else. You can see it's a very fake light, right? But even the men on the front, you can see they are brightly illuminated, and it couldn't be brightly illuminated at night like that. And they are also different from all their companions around them. The architecture is not respecting that. I mean, you can see there are a lot of liberties. If a painters wanted to have the highlight in the eye, he will just take a dip of white with his paint, with his brush, and just paint it on the eye of the subject. It doesn't take much, right? But when we are working with lighting, especially in video games, we don't have those kind of tools, right? We have tools that are based on reality, that try to recreate reality. They do not try to recreate brushstrokes. And then when we go to see how photographers and cinematographers work, the way they do it, they kind of try to imitate what the painters did, what the masters did. But of course they have huge limitations. They have limitations of space, of budget, of energy. They have limitations of many different things, of even just let's take this Pirates of the Caribbean example. You can't just take a huge light that needs to be powered by a lot of electricity in the middle of an island, right? That poses a lot of issues. But we don't have these limitations. We kind of try to do the same things, even in movies, not just video games. In CGI, we try to make these things in the same way, but we don't have these limitations. On the opposite side, we have huge liberties. I mean, we can turn the sun on and off. We can decide if any time of the day. We can orient it as we want it. We can place floating light even in front of the camera, and they will be invisible if we want it. They will just produce the light, but they won't be visible in the actual shot, right? So all this freedom creates a huge problem, because then the workflow, the creativity, of course it's not like that for everyone, but at least for me, when I have too many choices, I kind of get stuck, because I can't decide anymore if I don't have something limiting me. And I feel like this is something that really makes the difference between CGI, video games, and actual cinematography, actual photography. While again, painters, they didn't have limitations, but for them it was much easier to control light because they just will put a brushstroke where they wanted the highlight. We have this huge, usually complex simulation that we are doing. We are recreating the physics of light, of materials, and at the same time we don't have the limitations of movies, of reality. So we need something to be based upon. We need something that, as the texture artists based themselves on the actual material, real life material, as the animators base themselves on the video of the thing moving. As all the other disciplines take the references from something that is rooted in reality, we need to do the same. And this takes the name of physically based lighting. Of course, I didn't invent the concept. This is something that is, I feel like, still little known, little understood rather than known, because I'm hearing more and more people talking about PBL, but at the same time, they are either talking about it without understanding fully, or they give plain wrong informations on it, which of course creates more noise than anything else. So, but I feel like this is what is missing from a workflow, especially for we will see for large teams and complex projects. So let's go a little more deep into it. Of course, this that I will talk about is not the standard workflow in video games. It's not something that, as of now, is taken and used by everyone. There are still only few studios that are applying it, but more and more we are moving towards making it a standard, and more studios are starting to base their engines off of this, are starting to try to tie a workflow to this. So let's talk about what PBL, physically based lighting, exactly is. First of all, of course, it's tightly connected to PBR, physically based rendering, and both are basically a system that bases itself on working with physical values. And when we're talking about physical values, of course, we mean values and settings that are taken from how physics in real life work. It's a workflow that I like to say is based around causality. Which means that we do not control the parameters of light in a vacuum, but we always go and try to understand where an issue comes from, because of course light in real life just works. So anything that you can do or you can't do in real life, you can or can't do in the video games. Of course, there are cases and situations in which we might want to break that. We might want to make something that is not possible, but that should be a very conscious decision, and it should have a reason for that. One usually famous example is Control, which on the lighting side is one of my favorite games. They have a very unphysical light in the way it behaves for many reasons, but it still works very well because of the context, because of the story they are trying to tell, which perfectly needs something like that. But in most cases, we don't need to break physics of light, because again, light in real life works. So if something is broken, something is not working as expected as real life in our scenes, in our levels, we should investigate the cause of that and adjust that, not the light, because the light is always at the end of the pipeline and it's kind of the easier thing to fix, but not the best thing to fix. Okay. So When asking though why we should embrace PBL, there are, I feel, these three main reasons. The first one is realism. We are working on tools that are mostly trying to recreate real world, the real light simulation materials and all of that. As we go further and further away with our work from reality, we break the same tools we are building upon, and that creates, by experience, huge issues in our work, in our pipeline. And that, of course, then translate to a loss of flexibility. So, when we are adjusting each light in our scene with different parameters, like adjusting, the amount of indirect light, or we are removing maybe the specular, or all those kind of things, we are turning each light into a system by itself. Which, of course, means that if we need to do some changes, some basic changes, or either on the engine side or on our whole system, on our whole settings, that will mean that each light will behave then differently. They will not be unified. We will not fix maybe something that it was broken, but will create a number of problems all around our scenes. So that that makes it much harder to change direction, to fix issues. And then, of course, there's the matter of artistic direction. When we are talking about video games, of course, there are indies, there are smaller teams, but the big projects are made by big teams, and big teams are made of many individuals. And each of them has a unique vision, has a unique workflow, maybe has a unique sense of taste, which of course means that, especially for lighting, that it's kind of hard to equalize, to find a common direction for everyone to go towards. And again, PBL gives us a base for that, gives us a very fundamental terrain to build upon our whole work. And again, of course, it gives us some, I feel, helpful limitation, because again, if we can just turn off the sun instead of deciding to make a level at night, we should be asking why we need to do that, when cinematographers never had to do it, and when photographers never had to do it. Okay, so the rules of PBL are quite simple and very logical when you understand the concept of PBL. And of course, the very first one is that we do not change the behavior of light. So of course, we have to assume that the engine we're working on, the tools we are working with, are already set up correctly. They are simulating light in a correct way. But then when we are sure of that, we should not go and change things for a single light. And again, that goes back to the concept of causality, and we'll see some examples of that in a moment. Intensity is another important factor. Instead of just putting random values based on whatever the screen is showing us, we go in and put plausible values, physically plausible values. And to do that, we of course need physical units like lumens, like luxes, candelas, or that kind of tools. But again, we will see why that is so important. And of course, as we base the intensity off of plausible values, we should do the same with exposure. So our scenes should respect the exposure that we will have in real life. Just taking a camera and going out and shoot some photos and that should be kind of the same exposure that we should expect from our scenes. And then one that is sometimes kind of hard to abide to, but I feel is very important to build this kind of workflow, is that all lights should have a source. And with that, I mean that we should always have a prop that casts the light instead of just, using multiple lights or fake lights to kind of give that to move more the lights towards that direction, or to highlight that edge, all those kind of things that of course we all do. But when we're basing ourselves on physically based rendering, we should try to avoid. Again, we don't have the same goal as a cinematographer, because a cinematographer has a frame to compose. Is more in that sense similar to a painter. We have an environment, which means we have to be very careful with all kind of floating and fake lights, because they can very easily break the immersion when we go a little bit too heavy with them. And to speak about the first thing, the respecting the way light works, the very first thing we should respect is indirect light. Of course, direct light and indirect light gives us the whole composition. In this case, of course, it's very evident of how the wall behind is contributing to the indirect light that is falling back on the sphere, as you can see. The writing is in Italian. I forgot to translate it. I will later, but it just says that it just says the same thing. That's great. And of course, when we change the color, we get a lot of that color spill, how we call it, which creates, of course, a hugely important relationship between the direct light and the indirect light, because indirect light is what we will have in most of our scenes, probably. Especially if it's an interior, direct light will be scarce, and indirect light will be what fills everything up. So what if we want to control indirect light? What if we feel our scene is too dark? Because that can happen quite often. I have that experience myself. Then this is where the concept of causality comes in, which is what is causing the indirect light to be not enough. And the answer is always be albedo. Albedo is, simply put, the whiteness, so to speak, the brightness of our base color, of our texture. And of course, when we have a dark value for albedo, we get very few indirect light. When we have a bright albedo, we get a lot of indirect light. Now, the thing is, most of the time, we kind of base ourselves on our own site when judging if the albedo is too bright or too dark. But that creates an issue, because human vision is non-linear, which means we are much better at understanding what's in the shadows than what is in the highlights. And that is, of course, for evolutionary reasons. We are much more interested in seeing the tiger, between the leaves, than the difference of luminosity between the cloud and the sky. So our eyes adapted more to understand the difference of values in darker part of the spectrum. But that also means that when we are judging something like a material, that causes a lot of issues, because we are probably going way too dark than it should be. Because we should think about the fact that when we see something that we consider mid-gray, which is exactly in the middle between black and white, that is actually a 21% gray, which means that if we took a linear gradient from black to white, that middle gray will be actually in the first 20% of the gradient. But it also means that if an hypothetical ray of light hits a surface that is mid-gray, which in this image is the one on the right, if a ray of light hits that surface, it means that only 20% of that intensity is going to be bounced on the next object, on the next surface, which is a huge loss. It means that 80% of our intensity is completely lost. And in the same image, on the other side, on the left, we got an actual mid-gray, which is an actual in the actual middle between black and white. And that, for what we are used to, for a non-linear gradient, will be around 0.72, which is of course much higher than we would expect. Is beyond our 0.5. But you can see what huge difference it makes to our vision. Because in this example, the light is the same, the exposure is the same, absolutely nothing changed except for the albedo. And that might sound sometimes obvious. If I just make the texture brighter, then my light is going to be brighter. But if it's so obvious, why is not done more? Because having a brighter albedo is most of the time correct. In fact, what I see, of course, this example is little bit exaggerated, but what I most of the time see in this scene as well is that albedo is usually too dark, and that creates not enough indirect light, and so the lighting artist goes in and compensates by dragging up the indirect lighting factor, which creates other issues with PBR, with reflections and all that sort of stuff. So this again is the concept of causality, where we fix not the light, but what creates the issue for the light, which is albedo. Of course, the whole PBR thing says that most non-metals are between 0.2 and 0.9 of value. While metals are between 0.72, so our actual mid-gray and 1, which is usually much brighter than what I'm used to see around, at least. And we can get our own values, of course. There's a amazing resource from Gregor Baran, who went out with a spectrometer and just measured, I don't know how many they are, 100, 200 surfaces, to see what their actual value is. And we should always remember about calibrating our albedo to be, the kind of brightness we want. Because if we want to make a bright scene, we should keep in mind what kind of materials are bright for a bright scenes. If we want a dark scenes, then we can put darker materials. But then we should be aware that our light will die much, much faster. And that also is not just indirect light, but it's also a matter of the gradients. As lighting artists, gradients are one of our most important tools to make an image feel beautiful. And when we have dark albedo, most of that gradient is just eaten up by the dark albedo. So we just have a very bright hotspot. That's what happens most of the time. We have a very bright hotspot and then nothing. Just darkness. Another important rule that we should remember and know very well is the light fall-off factor. That is also something that is usually changed. And it's just a very simple rule that looks more complex than it actually is, which just says, when we double the distance from the light source, instead of having half the intensity, we have a quarter of the intensity. And that is because, of course, our rays, our photons are spread over an area, and then you go into geometry and see how it exactly works. But this is important to remember, because that's also something that I see being changed a lot of times, where we just change the fall-off factor to get more light reaching. But again, why is that happening? Why do we need to do that? And we should also consider that when we are, exposing for a subject, when we are placing our lights, because when we have a light which is dim and close to the subject, we are going to have a very strong fall off, because we double the distance from the light very quickly. But when we have a powerful far away light, we get a much more even illumination all across. So that's something that we should not change based on what we need, but we should consider when placing lights and when building our environments, because that is also something we should keep in mind. We can't, lighting doesn't exist in a vacuum, and we should always consider how light is going to work in an environment when we are building the environment, when we are designing the environment. If we need something like this on the left, we can think about a smaller space. If we want something like the one on the right, we have to think about larger spaces and maybe sources of light that could be natural light or very strong sources of light. We have to take that into consideration. We can't just apply successfully lighting at the end of the pipeline. It should be something that we start to consider it from the very beginning. And on that note, the most important example of this is the sun. The sun has basically zero fall-off factor, which means it doesn't decay because it's so far away that it just is the same intensity for the whole length of the Earth. So that is, of course, something that we should know. If you want to fake natural light, maybe we are in a cave and we want to have like a ray of light coming in and light, we should know that we should put the fall-off to zero. But in any other case, all lights behave the same. And if we have a source of light, then it should have the correct fall-off to look natural and feel natural and behave naturally. And then, of course, we have the relationship that is there between diffuse and specular. That is, of course, very much rooted again in PBR. It's about the energy conservation law. We get a bunch of diffuse and a bunch of specular, and together they amount to the total of light. If we turn off one, we start breaking things and getting wrong results and strange results. And again, that is not something that is always wrong. It can gives us a good result, but it's something that is not flexible. It's not most of the time realistic, and it might break immersion. It might break make some kind of strange effect to our viewer, and we should be all the time aware about these kind of issues. And then the last rule, so to speak, is about scattering factor. You know, when the light is being scattered by a medium, which of course is just make the volume thicker. You know, instead of just changing for that one light, which will look fake because you are going to have one light with a lot of fog, a light with less fog, and that is going to be odd and behave again strangely if we decide to change fog. Then working with exposure. And this is about, you know, going and taking references or looking for references and setting the exposure to be the right one instead of changing the light intensity. When we're talking about exposure, of course, we are talking about the light that reaches in the sensor or the film. And when we have a correctly exposed image is when we can see most of the information. Overexposed is when we have too much light hitting the sensor, and so the diodes or the silver particles get basically overblown, and we get a loss of information. And underexposed when we have a loss of information on the other side. So too little light hitting the sensor, and we lose a lot of details to black. That, of course, is not always the good definition of correct exposure, because correct is about the story we are telling, correct is about the mood we are trying to create, the medium with which we are doing it. Of course, for example, we can do it in a movie, we can underexpose, we can overexpose. If we do it in a video game during a combat section and the player can't see anything, that's, of course, maybe it's a great mood, but it's going to break the experience because the player is going to get frustrated. So it's also about the medium and the situation in which we are deciding what correct exposure is. And we should base again ourselves on real life values. In real life, we use exposure value, EV100, and different settings have different exposure values. And we should try to work with that instead of just, changing things and calibrating things on the fly. If we know the sun, direct sun on a bright day is going to be around 14 or 15 EV, then that's what we should set our scene to, and everything else accordingly. We should be controlling exposure and camera, not the actual light intensity. If the sun is too bright for an interior, then think about different ways to light the interior. Use more of the natural light. Use brighter lights if it's an environment that, of course, accommodates them. I wouldn't think of putting a super strong light in a living room because that will break immersion again. So we have to be aware of where we are setting our scenes, of what are our lighting necessities, of what are our lighting conditions, all that kind of stuff. So if I know I want more light in an interior and it's a living room and it's got to be day outside, then I either try to reduce the natural light to make it darker and so have more artificial light filling in, or I could set the day to be a gloomy day, a rainy day, so that the light outside is less strong than what is inside. So it's more about thinking about how we will think in a real world. If I was a photographer and I needed a good balance between natural light and artificial light, I would either choose an hour of the day where they are balanced, or a situation where there's no sun or it's not that strong, And again, this is just a very simple example of how we get different results just by changing exposure. We don't need to change the lights. Lights should be just set to the right amount of intensity, and then we control exposure to get the feel and the look that we want. In that way, we are controlling one parameter instead of one for each light. And of course, this is tightly connected, as we've been saying until now, to intensity. Because we need, again, it's in Italian, okay, I will fix it. But again, we need to be aware of what light sources in real life are, intensity-wise. So we can't just have any arbitrary value. Like for example, one issue I see very often, especially in indie games, is when you have a car, for example, with what are they called? With lights, the car lights, and it's day, and you can still see the car lights. That is wrong. It doesn't happen in real life. If you turn on your car lights with a bright sunny day, you are not going to see them. And that is why it's so important to start thinking about intensities in the correct way. And the two most fundamental light units that we can use are lux and lumens. Lumens, they are of course different units. I won't explain exactly what they mean because that will be kind of a longer, we don't have time for that. But what you need to know is that most common household lights go from 400 to 1600 lumens. 1600 is a bit on the higher end, but you can find them if you go to anywhere you can buy light bulbs. And of course, there are much stronger sources of light. There are floodlights for roadworks. There are stadium lights those go crazily bright. But then each kind of light source has its own intensity. You know, we can't put the intensity of a stadium light inside of a living room, because that breaks immersion, that breaks the relationship we have between natural light and interior light, what also our brain expects. Our brain has been evolving for millions of years and is so acquainted to the relationships between light sources that if we break those relationships, the brain kind of understand that even subconsciously we are still taking away immersion, even if it doesn't maybe sometimes looks like. And also, of course, as we said before, we create a lot of issues in our workflow. And the sun instead is around 120,000 lux when it's a sunny day. Some tools account for that, like for example Unreal has a very cool atmospheric system which basically scales the sun intensity based on how it is oriented in the sky. So if it's sunset, it's going to be less intense. You can change the atmosphere, and that also changes the intensity of the sun. But that is the amount of light that we get on Earth from the sun. We don't measure it in lumens because lumens is the kind of the total energy, the total light that a light source emits, while lux is the amount of light that reaches a surface. And since we are on Earth, we are more interested on the amount of light that reaches us than what the sun outputs in its totality, which will be, as you can see, this very big number that I can't read, which will be quite of the hassle to just write every time on the parameters of intensity of the sun. So it's much easier to use different units for different situations, but the base idea is always the same. We take a look at what the actual intensity is in real life, and we try to use that and then to calibrate our exposures and our situations, our environments, so that we get the kind of light that we need. And again, this is very important because of the relationships between light. Again, our brain is very acquainted with this kind of stuff, especially in this day and age where artificial light is everywhere. We know very well at different times of day what to expect, and in different locations as well. If I'm instead of, I don't know, a store, I will have a different light than what I have in my living room. If I'm on the street, and I will have a different intensity and color as well from the lights on the street than I will have from I don't know, any other place. So all these things help us to work because it makes it easier for us to control everything, and also keeps it realistic. Just imagine now, of course, open world games are more and more being produced. Just think about how you can feel a double-digit square kilometers map of lights if you control each single parameter of those lights. It's going to be crazy. You can't do it. That's why we have so much crunching in the industry as well, because some workflows work against us. When we want control over all the parameters, we then have to use that control. We can't just let those parameters be if we first touch them. You either don't touch them for anything, or you touch them for everything. So we kind of always have to think about that as well, flexibility, and working in big projects where we have so many things to light and so many places to put light on. And then, of course, what we should be thinking really about once we have made a decision on the nature of our light source is just where to put it. So if we have a living room floor lamp, we already know the size that it's going to be. If we have, of course, the prop, we already know the intensity it should be. We could even just already decide the color of it using color temperature, and then we can just place it. and forget about all those technicalities and all those things that, of course, as lighting artists, we need to know, we need to understand. But if they are just set and we know they work because they are based on real life, then you can place that light anywhere and it will just work. And position and the nature of the light and its position is what really, I feel, brings out the artistic decisions that we can make. Because then with light we are not just thinking about shapes and composition and light and shadows and colors, but we are also thinking about the story we are telling. Why I'm picking this light source to put here? What is it giving me? Why this one? Why here? It's a question that we need to be asking when we are telling a story. If I put a light inside a closet, I'm telling something. If it's a huge light, I'm telling something else. If it's a smaller light, I'm telling something else. It's all those small decisions that we should consider when we are thinking about a story, think about the characters that leave a space, because as video game artists, or designers, we need to always be thinking about a space, an experience. A space is always inhabited by someone or something, and we need to be thinking about that. What do they need the light for? What do they use the light for? What kind of light they have at their disposal. One simple example from my work is on Avatar. RGA, the humans, have of course electric light. Navi don't have electric light. They have bioluminescence or whatever. Those decisions make a huge difference for the player. And they are not because they are telling the story. They are narrating just not the place, but also the characters they inhabit the space. Of course, and then there's all the usual stuff: small light, harsh light, large light, soft light. The distance from the subject gives us different result in that term. It's all just decisions, that we kind of understand subconsciously once everything else is set. So our goal should be to get the tools right, and then to just forget about those and get things to work in the most simple way. And again, this is a beautiful example of this. This is a shot taken from Not a Country for Old Men, and it's not a shot that I would call beautiful in the traditional sense. We have a harsh light, we have kind of an ugly light, especially the one in the bathroom. But it's perfect for the scene, it's perfect for the character, it's perfect for the events that bring us to this moment. So for who hasn't seen the movie, the context is that he gets in here, kill the guys in all the fight, the lamp falls down, and then you have this shot where you have this lamp that is just naturally fallen on the ground, because of the story, and is lighting him from below, and it's giving you, of course, the very common bad guy lit from below, scary guy lit from below trope. But it's doing it in a natural way. There's no fake light, no fake bounce or anything like that. And then in the corner of the shot, we have this just very harsh light, the light that you will find in a bathroom. You have the ceiling source, and then you have the one above the mirror, and it's just showing the dead guy in a brightly lit room, because this is brightly lit because everything else is only lit by probably a ceiling light, a very dim ceiling light, and a abajur on the ground. So it works because they chose the materials that they needed to get this difference, to get him to be in the dark and to get him to be in the bright, and then this contrast gives you the 2 points of interest, and everything is very organic, everything is very natural. And because of how Roger Deakins, the cinematographer, works, there is no fake stuff here. if we were to do it probably as CG artists, we will start placing fake lights here and there. Get the rim light, get the shaping, get the a little bit more bounce. He doesn't care about that in this shot. He just getting organically to where he wants to get the scene, and then he's just using what is there to tell the story. And I feel like that is the best way to work in this day and age where physically based rendering is getting much more important than before. We are kind of getting more and more powerful hardware to do it, ray tracing and everything. It's all slowly leading to a stronger and more accurate simulation of reality. But if we strive from reality while we are trying to simulate it, it's two opposing forces pulling on the opposite sides, and that's going to just break our work. So we kind of have to embrace reality, and of course we can break it from time to time. This is not an absolute rule that we just need to follow blindly, but we always need to be conscious why we are breaking it and if it's the right way to do it. Because again, if I'm saying, oh yeah, my scene is too dark and I want it to be brighter, why am I increasing the light indirect lighting factor instead of the albedo, which is the most probable cause of the low indirect light? So every decision should be very well pondered upon before taking and breaking physics. Because again, in real life, we don't need to do it, then we shouldn't be doing it in most situations as well in our work. And that's, I think, yeah, that's pretty much it. I could have showed a little bit in engine, but I feel like maybe it's more interesting if we get to the questions, if there are any.
Yeah, there's a few actually. So the first one from within the comments section is this from Jordan. Can curtains be a source of scatter?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a little bit harder in video games when you are working in real time, because of course that is something that is a much more complex situation to have compared to other things. But if you're working, for example, in CGI, it's absolutely that's thinking in a more holistic way. My mentor Tilman Milde uses this term, holistic lighting, where you are not just thinking about the light, but you are thinking how you can use the environment, how you can blend it with the environment. And using the curtains is a very good example of that. If I need a more diffuse light, instead of just putting a giant light outside a window, invisible light, to get more soft light, I can just draw the curtain and get soft light that way. That's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah, there's another one from Eleanor that is, how can we go about finding resources that help us to understand the properties of materials and to follow a PBL pipeline?
That's a very good question. I think the only resource that you might need is probably the Substance PBR guide. They made an excellent guide. You can find it online. And it basically explains what PBR means, because I feel like that's kind of like PBL. A lot of people know about it, but I have a very hard time finding people that can actually explain it and that can understand it beyond the metalness and roughness thing. So the Substance PBR guide is an excellent resource for that. I also talked about the resource that Gregor's has. That's not free, but I feel like for the amount of work he did, it's a very fair price. I think it's around 25 euros or dollars. And that has both a guide on basically PBR itself, on how materials behave, and also the list of all the ones that he scanned himself. And I think if you have these two resources, you're already like, you know, more than 80% of the people. And then of course there is all the look dev stuff. I'm not much into that. I didn't look for it much, but if you look around for look dev, that's basically their role. Look dev is about assuring that the material that of the asset of the object is physically correct. So that's another good starting point for research. And if you are talking about lighting, like exposure values and that kind of stuff, a very good thing that you can use is just go to the, in my case, supermarket, look at the light bulbs that you can find there. If you have a specific environment, look for producers that make those kind of lights. So for example, if you're lighting a stadium, go and look on the internet for producers of stadium lights. They will have eventually the value in wattage on lumens, some sort of value to give an idea of the strength of the light. For exposure, an excellent website is Flickr, because there the photos that are posted have the I mean, not all of them, most of them have the camera settings. So from those, you can derive your exposure values, and you can look for different situations, the one that you need or whatever. That's also an excellent way to look at it.
Lovely, thank you. The next question. Hey Filippo, thank you very much for the talk. How would you determine lux intensity on emissive values used in materials?
That is a very good question, and a very hard to answer question, because when you're talking about emissive, first of all, you're not talking anymore in lux usually, because you're setting the emissivity, and you're more talking about candelas per square meter, which are also called nits. For screen, for example, that's the value. The issue with that is that most of the time they are very hard to calculate, because it matters the surface area, it matters how the, for example, on a light bulb, it matters how the glass refracts and scatters the light rays. So what I do most of the time is go kind of artistically on that one. So when I have the intensity of my light and I have my scene set, then I just start working on it to kind of get to the right value where it's kind of maybe glowing with the bloom and gives you the sense of brightness, because that is not very important. It's just something that is visual. It's not going to actually light your scene. But if you want to be a little bit more physical correct, then you can just put the lumen value in it. Most of the time it works. Some other times it might not. Then you just eyeball it, because it's very hard to determine exactly a value in candela per square meters for an emissive source. Unreal uses the candelas per square meter, for example. I think it's pretty much standard. You should also be aware if that's the case. You should always try to understand if the tool you're using is expressing that in any kind of physical units, because that might not be the case.
Okay, so the next question is going to be from me in preparation for the students that are about to embark on the lighting art module at staffs. They're going to be looking at doing lighting for an exterior and as well as an interior. So they're going to be two different types of lighting setup. How would your initial lighting setup alter depending on those two scenarios?
So you mean like a scenario that has both things, or like either one or the other?
One that has both things, but also if they are removed, is there a different way that you would set it up?
Of course, when I have an exterior as well, that's the first thing that I start working on, because natural light is our, main source of light. Even in an interior, if you think about it, most of the time, you don't turn on lights during daytime, because you don't need them. You have windows and enough light is coming from there. So that's my first thing.
I'm glad you said that. I always say outside in.
I always set up the natural light first. Once that's working correctly, once that's set up with the right values, and of course, the sun is oriented how I want it, and or how the concept requires it, then I start looking at the interiors. If the interiors are too dark, I can do one of two things. One is, as we saw, change exposure, which most of the time will probably work. But say, for example, you have a room which has no window, no direct natural light coming in, then you might need, as you would in real life, probably put a light bulb there and just get a source of light inside of it. But to be honest, even here at home, I have closets. Even during daytime, even if there's not a window shooting against them, I can clearly see because again, natural light is so much stronger than that we are used to think about most of the time. So it should be enough.
Okay, so the next one I was going to ask, because you actually talked about working with others and larger scenes, so I thought I'd dive a little bit into that with the next question. What tips would you give people to remain consistent on a large lighting scale for an environment where you've got lots of other artists working on lighting for their own aspects of the environment? Is there any sort of pitfalls that you should try and completely, I guess, stay clear of? And if there's any sort of tips that you can give on how to more successfully manage that kind of a setup, what would they be?
So the very first thing is communication. That is the most important thing, and not only between lighters, because again, light doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's connected to all other disciplines. It's connected to shapes of the models. It's connected to, as we saw, to the textures. It's connected to, in video games, especially to game design and the gameplay flow and all that kind of stuff. So keeping the communication open is the very basic and foremost thing. You have to speak with all the people, to speak with all the team, get aligned. And when it comes to lighting, it's very important to, of course, have a shared workflow where you know what you want to get, what are the rules, and you try to work on those and stay on those. And again, communications between team members. But at least from my experience, most of the time, then there's ownership of the space. So you have your own part of the environment. Someone else has their own part of the environment. So there's going to be differences, of course, which is why we use documentations, which is why we talk and we set up these kind of workflows, which are common workflows, to kind of avoid these differences or very stark differences. But then it also comes, down to each other's taste, and that will create differences, which I think is also what makes interesting some environments. But again, talking a lot and communicating a lot is super important. Having common references, if the environment allows for it, it's super important. Having art direction as well. That's why we have directors in the industry, right? Because they are the people that are supposed to ease the communications between teams. They are the people that are supposed to take many different minds and direct them towards the same goal. So that is also very important, to speak for a director with the people and to connect them, and for the people to speak with the director. Getting feedback and all that kind of stuff. The communication, I feel, is probably the common ground for all these things I'm saying. If you don't have that, it's going to be a mess. That's 100% for sure.
So you're bound to see lots of times where people are not getting it right and not communicating as you would expect. What are the more common pitfalls that you see from other lighting artists when either working together or initially in development of their portfolio pieces?
That's a good question. So many of the pitfalls usually come down again to kind of not understanding correctly the needs of what they are doing. So, for example, a lighting artist that just lights in a vacuum based on his own, on their own um, taste, kind of creates issues then, because again, I'm talking about video games, of course, because that's my experiences. It's very common to see maybe, you know, that level that doesn't work very well lighting wise when you are playing it. But if you just look at it, it looks maybe very, very good. But again, when you then taking the controller in your hand and you start shooting enemies or climbing around, that doesn't work anymore, because the lighter didn't talk maybe with the level designers, didn't talk with the level artists. They didn't get a common ground. They didn't understand each other needs. So maybe you might even see again the environment that is disconnected from the lighting. That is one of the most common pitfalls. In when it comes to portfolios, what I see instead is kind of most of what I've been talking about. So not understanding the technical part of lighting and just the more artistic part of it. The artistic part, of course, requires you to develop your eye, to develop your taste. So it takes time. But if you have that and you don't have the technical part of it, you are going to have a much harder time get everything to work. Like, for example, something that I never realized until not long ago is that Unreal Engine's tone mapper is very bad. And if you
It's funny
don't
you
know,
should say that. You know, the
why?
last sessions I did with prop artists was talking about altering the tone mapper in the command console because of the textures just aren't sharp
Yeah.
enough and all this sort of things as well.
I mean, that is very true. But the issue then is that if you don't know that, if you don't know what to look for, you're just going to go crazy. And that's when you kind of resort to the fake values of light, when you start changing how light behaves, because you can't get something that is natural looking, you know? But because there are other systems in play. If you don't know about albedo, you're going to change the indirect light factor. If you don't know about the sun fall off of zero, you're going to have a hard time getting a fake sun from a spotlight, for example. All that kind of stuff. If you don't know the technical part, you won't get to the good artistic part in an easy way. And even if you get there, you might do things in the wrong way, unoptimized for video games, or more complex than they need to be for other things. So I'd say know very well your tools, learn to debug because that's super important. Learn to understand where the issue is so that you don't go fix the wrong one, because you might be fixing the wrong one and then you still have the base problem that caused you to go there, and then you also have something that is different and you might go and do a huge amount of work for nothing. You know, have a clear understanding and approach to your tools. That's also super, super important. You don't have, of course, to know how rendering engine works on the background, but know how light works, how the render engines try to give you what you are looking at, what are the parts of the rendering process. So, you know, HDR stuff, the tone mapper, the light behavior, all that kind of stuff. I'd say that's something that I will suggest to anyone who's working on their portfolio, who's doing it for lighting.
I'm going to give you one last question from Jordan, which I think is perhaps slightly hopeful, but still, is there anything like a games artist lighting Bible?
I wish. Not that I can think of. There are a lot of good resources. But I feel personally that I learned the most when I started studying physically based lighting. Before that, you can learn the art fundamentals pretty much everywhere. There are so many good resources for that, even just YouTube, just um, take an art class or something like that you're going to learn about chiaroscuro, you're going to learn about shapes, you're going to learn about contrasts and colors and palettes. That's all over the artistic world. Even just study movies and how they do things. That always the same kind of stuff. It's not different for video games. But then when it comes to video games themselves, then you are not working on a frame anymore. You are working on a space. So I would say, beyond the physically based lighting, one thing I can really recommend, which might be counterintuitive because I think I never had it as a advice. I kind of had it by a friend who is a lighting designer, which means it actually goes in places to establish how lights should be, like real places. But otherwise, I never had it, and it's to study lighting design for architecture. Because again, our discipline is closer to architecture than it is to movies or paintings, because we are architecting an experience. We are building spaces that needs to be explored, and the player needs to move in, and we need to have things happening in them. So you can't just approach them like a static frame, like most of the art teaches you to. You need to approach them like an architect would, like an architect builds spaces and creates experiences. And one very good book for that, I think it's called. Um, oh my god, I can't remember. Can I get back to you with the title later, and you can share it, because I can find it on top of my mind. But in general, lighting for architecture is a very good starting point when you want to do lighting for video games. It will teach you a lot of things, because when an architect speaks about space, about architecture, you could just cancel those words and change them for level design. It's the exact same thing.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time, Filippo. It's been really interesting talk, and definitely something I bet a fair few people will be watching back to remember a couple of the points that you've made. So again, a really specialist talk today, and one that I think that you don't get too many of online either. So that's why it's something that I certainly think that very good to have. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Lovely. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. We hope that you've enjoyed today's talks at Fuse Games Conference. We hope that you'll join us again tomorrow at 10 a.m. for the second day of Industry Guest Talks. Our first one is at 10 a.m. with Jan Miguel da Silva, a 3D game artist at Marmalade, who is specialising in character art. So thanks very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.